Hello and welcome to St. Photius Orthodox Theological Seminary. With the blessings of Bishop Auxentius, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's roundtable panel. We have the distinct honor and privilege of welcoming the Right Reverend Bishop Maximus of Pelagonia, the Very Reverend Archimandrite Father Dr. Patapios, the Seminary Dean, and a very special guest, Dr. John Vervaeke, for this event, the first of its kind here at St. Photius Seminary. As we are all very much looking forward to the upcoming conversation, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming His Grace, Bishop Maximus, Father Patapios, and Dr. John Vervaeke.
Thank you, Alexei, for the introduction. Thank you, all of you guests who are here present and those who are listening on YouTube. I would like to thank, first of all, Dr. John Vervaeke for coming to visit the seminary, for honoring us with your presence, which has been truly delightful, and for the wonderful conversations that we've already had, and that I hope that we're going to continue right now. I would like to thank Father Patapios, the Dean of St. Photius Theological Seminary, for participating in this little panel discussion that we're going to have, which is on a philosophical topic. Father Patapios is himself a teacher of philosophy and a scholar. I'm hoping that we have a good connection and little group here for us to have our, well, I hope our dialogue into dialogos. What exactly is your theory that you are proposing on emergence and emanation? You gave a wonderful, absolutely wonderful and moving talk at the, I believe it was the Concilians conference, yes, in which you explained some of your ideas about emergence and emanation, and you drew a very, very broad picture of what this is and what this means. You referenced quite a few scholarly works on this. A large amount of, let's say, background scholarship has been done on this work, and there are other philosophers who are working, let's say, explicitly in this field now, and it's a growing field with growing acceptance. And but I would like to think, and I do believe, and I will say to you that I think you are at the forefront of both the scientific aspect and the philosophical aspect of this question. So, if you would do us the favor of explaining your thoughts on the matter, your theories, your ideas, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Bishop. So I won't repeat the entire argument, because that took me an hour and 20 minutes.
Although you wouldn't bore us if you did.
Well, I'll try and give the gist of it. The larger context of the argument is I was trying to make a case for what I call strong transcendence, which is an idea of transcendence that is not just psychological self-improvement, but a sense of transcendence that has genuine epistemological and ontological import. And there was two components to that overarching argument. One is this one that we're going to go into detail, which is the argument for the levels of being, the emergence emanation argument. And another argument was not a restoration, because there's been important innovation, but a return in some sense to a conformity theory of knowing. And then the idea is when you have those two, you have the basis for the proposal of a strong transcendence. The argument I offer is a convergence of other people's arguments, which of course raises the plausibility of the conclusion, because the degree to which you have independent arguments
Right.
converging means you can reduce the probability that that conclusion is due to subjectivity or bias from any one of the arguments. Of course, it doesn't give you certainty, but plausibility, the more you increase plausibility, the more you should take an argument seriously. So there was 4 core arguments I made use of. One is from Blackowitz in a wonderful book called The Essential Difference. And first of all, it might be good to say what's the foil, what's the position that this is against. And one is what's been called a flat ontology. The idea, so you'll catch this in a phrase when people say things like love is nothing but a chemical reaction in the brain, in which there's a reduction to a lower level. And then if the person adopts that reductive ontology, I think Ned Block's argument is I can't see how to refute it. Once you make that move, you have to drop to the very bottom level, the most bottom level in your ontology is the only level that's real, and everything above it is illusory to varying degrees. Now, this is often called, and I did talk about it in the talk, a flat ontology, and that's what I want to argue against. I want to argue that there's levels. But I want to point out something that I didn't do there, but I did do recently at Chino, and it was picked up. That reductive ontology is actually kind of an inverted Neoplatonism, because what it has is the very bottom is real, and then as you move away from the bottom, things become illusory, which is the opposite of sort of a classical Platonian. The very top is the most real, and as you move away from that, you get less real. So that's already, right, an opening for argumentation, because if you already have a leveled ontology, then there's room for negotiation. So just set that in context. But what Blackowitz's argument, and then I do something with it, his argument is you get reductionism by saying the properties that are shared are the properties that are most real. And so, for example, all of these things are made of matter, and therefore matter is most real than the particular things they are, because that's the shared property. And the idea is you go down deeper and deeper, you get the most shared property, which is something like boson, Higgs, or quantum probability wave distributions or something. And his point, and I think the point is very well made, is emergence is basically the proposal that there are differences that really matter to the reality of things. Right? And so that's why it's called the essential difference. And so the way I've integrated that argument with a scientific approach is this idea that we have to be very careful not to equivocate. There's an everyday sense of information which is meaningful ideas in your mind. And then there's a technical sense of information as measured by information theory. But all we need to know is that for sake of our discussion, is information depends on real differences. Because if everything is, right, if there's absolute homogeneity, there's actually no predictive relationship between events. They're all equal, and therefore there is no information in a technical sense actually available. So information actually depends on there being real relations, real differences. So this idea of real information requires real difference, and real difference means there has to be emergence. There has to be something other than the bottom level properties in order for there to be real information, etc. So the second is an argument from by Hoel, H-O-E-E-L, and one of my students, Emre Alke, brought that to my attention, as did somebody I've had a couple of very good conversations with, public, the biologist, Michael Levin. But it's basically the idea that in order for there to be real causal relations, there has to be real communication of information. So let's make it, instead of abstract, in order for an amoeba to hang together in its amoeba, parts of the amoeba have to communicate and causally interact with each other, or it just falls, it will lose its integrity as an amoeba. Now the thing about communication in the Shannon sense is communication is not dependent on just the signal that's sent. Because if you just send a signal without doing anything to it, the signal will degrade. It will, because of noise, entropy, the signal will degrade. So in order to get a signal received, meaning it shows up at the causal reception the same way it was at the causal sending, you have to put in redundancy. So for example, I could remove, you can actually do this in psychology, you can take a text and you can remove all the vowels, and people can still read the text.
At least in English.
At least in English. So yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to be presumptuous. But they will read it slower, because the vowels provide redundancy. Because if all you see is CT, you don't know if that's cut or cat, right? So you have to put in redundancy in the signal in order to make sure that it's basically you encode the signal, you put in repetition, you put in patterning in order to make sure that the signal makes it all the way through. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
Right. Now that redundancy, therefore, is not at the level. You need it to be at a higher level so you can have multiple pathways that get you from the transmission of the signal to the reception of the signal. And so what Hole is able to mathematically prove, by the way, and I had Emre, who's talented in math, go through this very carefully. And there's no logical mathematical error in the proof. Is that level of redundancy has is higher than the lower level, and has causal powers that are irreducible to the lower level.
That's fascinating, and it's for me it's incredible that that's been proven mathematically. When I've not read that paper, so and I would probably be lost if I were trying to read it, because my math abilities aren't at that level. Was he in that paper trying to prove that with respect to a specific example, like the signal, or did he present it in a purely generalized fashion?
It's a purely generalized fashion, and it has an interesting, and this will, and I didn't make use of it in the talk you saw, but there's an important result that comes from it. Because he did it general, it's also the case that different levels give you different causal access to reality because of this. So it's not just more and more as you go up, or less and less you go down. They all make unique and important contributions, each level, that cannot be captured completely by any of the other levels. And this is part of why I argue for a complete interpenetration, which we'll come back to.
Right. When you say that he proved it mathematically, did he, let's say, prove simply the fact that the let's say that the pattern must be distinct and real, or did he explicitly prove that there are multiple levels of the patterns?
So he explicitly proved the first, and then he showed that the second was derivable from that proof. Okay. I don't know if that move, I think it's all in one paper, but it also might be distributed, the two arguments. I'm not quite clearly remembering, but I'm confident in what I just said to it, but I don't know if both of those moves are in the same paper.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, there's a very logical extrapolation there, and that idea is developed by a lot of other scholars.
Yes.
So.
Yes. So in the first argument, the real information. Forgive me. Real information requires a leveled ontology. The second argument says, for real causal signaling, you need a leveled ontology. The third argument is from an astonishing book called Dynamics in Action by Alicia Urrero. There's very similar arguments by Terence Deacon in Incomplete Nature. she has priority. Apparently he was found innocent, but I've seen slides of, he claimed he didn't know of Urero's work, where he's standing with Alicia Urero and her argument is on
You mean that he plagiarized her work?
Yeah, she claims that.
She claims that.
Oh, dear.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is not to say that there are not original ideas in Incomplete Nature. And Deacon has a new book coming out that I think will be much more original. I'm not taking, I think Alicia Urero is right, but that's not germane to this. I'm not censoring Deacon. I think people should read Deacon. Okay, but Alicia Urero has basically made a very important argument, so this argument is basically a way of bringing back Aristotle's notion of final cause within formal theory. Not final cause, formal cause within formal theory. And then there's something like a final cause that comes out of it, but the key thing is formal cause, I should say. And so one of the things that she focuses on Kant's interpretation of causation by the time we've gotten to Newton, how all of the causes, all of the classic, I was taught to actually call them the Aristotelian B causes rather than causes in order to make a distinction, because I think that's very helpful.
B as in the letter B?
No,
B as in
our word because.
Oh,
because, okay.
they're really
okay, right,
explanations.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Christopher Shields, for example, his work on Aristotle, explanations, that's really the best way of understanding them. Is misleading because the Humean association with dominant model of efficient causality.
Right, and the fact that the efficient causality is itself been reduced to locomotion causation, whereas efficient causation in Aristotle is primarily the coming to be of something rather than one thing bumping into another.
It's also mental, so it's in the mind of the sculptor, for example, the statue takes shape. It's not just a matter of person A and object O and so on. Exactly, yeah.
So Urero picks up on Kant, and so the classic human model is bumpation, as it's sometimes it's called, right? The billiard ball bumps into one and it goes on. Yeah. And Kant says this is wonderful because what it does is it prevents circular causation, because you explain event E in terms of event D, and then D in terms of C, and C and B and A. And then of course there's a problem of how it gets started, and he says you can't invoke God, and then he gets into his own self-contradiction, as Fichte wonderfully pointed out. The argument that would preclude God would equally preclude the thing in itself. And so, but we'll put all that aside. At least there's this. And then, of course, Kant faced the problem. He went out and he saw a tree, and he doesn't get linear causation. He gets feedback. You know, the tree causes the leaves, but the leaves energize and cause the tree. And this is, Urero claims he's the first person to introduce this term. He says the tree is self-organizing, and therefore he says there can never be a science of living things, because self-organization would involve circular causation, and circular causation would give you circular explanation, and circular explanation is no explanation at all.
The problem is here, I guess, when we look at it in the broader historical context, is that with the development of modern science and the scientific revolution in the 17th century and the simultaneous or near simultaneous development of modern philosophy, which is a conscious departure from ancient philosophy, whether ancient philosophy is being understood, in the more Aristotelian vein or in the more Platonic vein, but there's tremendous crossover between the two, whichever side you're going to take. The reduction, modern science involves the reduction of Aristotle's four causes simply down to the efficient cause.
And the efficient cause is itself reduced.
Is itself reduced too.
Yes,
so,
right.
According to Aristotle's theory of causation, which was generally accepted by everybody up until the 17th century at least, you have the efficient cause, which is, I guess, what we would think nowadays as the direct causation, what is making that thing happen. And then we have, according to Aristotle, there's what's called the material cause, which is the object of what's happening. And then there's the the formal cause, which is the structure or the pattern, the organization.
Yes, exactly.
And then there is the final cause, which is the purpose of why that thing is there. And sometimes the final cause is referred back to itself, and sometimes it's placed outwards towards some other goal, and then of course connected with human intention.
And you might add that the final cause and the formal cause and the efficient are sometimes coexist in the same entity. So a horse, mature horse, is the cause of the infant horse, the foal. It's also the telos, the goal to which the young horse is moving, and it's also the structure and the definition, the pattern, all those things of the horse. So it's sometimes all three are in one, but sometimes the formal and the final aren't always easy to separate out. Sometimes it's hard to know.
Especially in artifacts.
Especially in artifacts, especially there, yeah.
But
what a rich notion of causality this is.
It's very rich, and I just wanted to make that little explanation for
Please.
people who people who aren't familiar with some of these, because but it's tremendously important, because this was the understanding of causation that existed, that was universally accepted by everybody
In multiple civilizations.
multiple civilizations.
Multiple civilizations.
The Arab civilization.
With the Arabs, and of course an Orthodox civilization. It's not something that the fathers of the church talk about very frequently, but they do mention it, and it's always in the context of everybody assumes that this is true and this is the way things are. It's almost like just a given fact. And of course, this was highly developed in scholasticism in the Roman Catholic Church. It was part of the revival of Neoplatonism in the Renaissance. So it was universally accepted. And then we have the scientific revolution of the 17th century comes along, and it's narrowly focusing on the efficient cause. And when you combine at least this is my take on it, if you combine that scientific revolution's a narrow focus on efficient causes and the investigation into efficient causes, which of course was tremendously productive in the scientific and ultimately technological sense. But then when you combine that with nominalism, which had developed and become quite prominent from the 14th century onwards, the nominalism, of course, which denies that there is a structure or pattern outside of the human mind. That results in an abolition of all of those other causes, and a total reduction down to just the efficient cause. But then now we're seeing, and I'm not sure how much of this is because the actual advance of science, which is wakening us up to something we lost. We are seeing that in order for us to have a more complete and a more coherent explanation of actual scientific facts, not even starting from the philosophical angle, but really from the scientific perspective, you need to reintroduce these other causes in order to have a complete or at least a fuller explanation of what's going on simply on the scientific level.
I think that's very fair. That's where Guerrero accepts. So she, like if you put something on here, like let's say a cylinder, and I pushed it, and then you ask the question, why does it roll? Most people are fixated on the events and the efficient cause between the events. So because you pushed it, and then Guerrero says, well, step back. What else? And notice how the question changes. What else has to be true in order for the cylinder to roll? Well, the cylinder has to have the particular shape it does. The table has to be flat. There has to be no other solid objects in front. So what you have are a set of conditions, and conditions are not events. They are dispositions for events.
Dispositions, right.
That's made a comeback recently. Dispositions is a powerful new tool in contemporary
But
thought.
but the idea of
Very
dispositions ultimately refers back to the Aristotelian idea of potentiality.
Yes.
Absolutely, yes,
Right.
absolutely. The modality is actually built into reality.
Yes. Yes.
Imagine that modality is part of reality. That's an astounding thought.
And she picks that up. She picks up that and this is the way you escape the circularity, because there's actually a modal move. So the move is she makes a distinction, and I think the distinction is very helpful, rhetorically very helpful. She makes a distinction between causes, which are relations between events, and constraints, which are relations between conditions. And then the idea is causes shape actuality and conditions shape possibility. Causes make things happen and constraints make things possible. And so you have actuality and possibility. And of course, when you're shaping possibility, you can talk about potentiality, right?
Right.
And so it's exactly that. And she's very clear that she's getting this from Aristotle. And so she said, okay, so what you need now is you have this distinction between causes and constraints, and then you have a distinction within constraints between two types of constraints, which she calls selective and enabling constraints. Selective constraints reduce the options for some system, like this way, which is how we normally think of constraint.
Right.
But we have to think of it in an unmarked fashion. There's also constraints that enable or make more possibilities for something. And then what you have is this relationship between selective and enabling constraints that very, very powerfully, top down and bottom up, shape the possibility space. And then now here's how you put it together. So let's go back to Kant's tree. So you have all these causal events, microchemical events happening, and they're causing a particular structure. But why does the tree take that structure? The tree takes that structure in order to change the possibility, increase the probability that a photon will hit a chlorophyll molecule, right? So the structure alters the probability of the events, see the top down, and then the events cause and give rise to the structure. And that is not a circular explanation, because I'm moving between actuality and possibility, which are real modal differences. And so the circular explanation is removed. And then what that does for you is it gives you a very powerful way of talking bottom-up emergence and top-down constraint.
Which have to be essentially simultaneous.
Yes.
That's very
I can
important.
say that you could never have a temporal difference between the two.
No, and this will open up the next argument, which bumpation really gets us focused on the horizontal. But as soon as and what you said, I completely agree with, and many people were, you need an ontological relation of causation, or I would say causation and constraint, right? And that's a vertical axis. It will, because I'm using vertical to mean relationship between ontological levels, and horizontal to mean like this efficient causal relationship.
Yeah,
between
that's a very I think useful way to think
Very
of it,
good.
and
Yes.
I mean I think of it in broadly similar
agree.
terms as well. Although I would say actually you can take that these ways of talking about vertical and horizontal, and you can extend it into other fields as well, which I think you do in some of your work.
So that leads into the next argument. And notice how all these arguments start from different premises, but they're coming to a convergent conclusion. But so the first one was about real information, the second one real causal signaling. This is about the need for structural functional organization, right? That's my way of thinking about formal causation. Because when you're talking about an organization of these constraints, that's
right. I mean, I think of it more in terms of patterns.
That's fine.
But I think it's really the same thing.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But the next argument is from Wolfgang Smith, who I've had the great pleasure of.
I was astounded by him. You know, he's an eminent mathematician, right?
Yeah.
And you know, he speaks about He's a Platonist, and
we struck such a chord,
right.
you know.
But he's also a pious Roman Catholic.
Yes.
And you know, he puts these together in ways which are, I think, quite thought-provoking. And what I was utterly astonished to learn is that he's in his 90s.
Yeah.
And he's able to have these conversations on such a high level and at a completely, you know, not only coherent but you know, thought-provoking and original way, which is, you know,
still sharp.
well, God bless him, you know, that's what a gift.
It's become something that's, I don't know what to call it, but I've been sort of rushed to talking to people because they're like Wolfgang, they're in old age, and recently Pierre Grimes, and he's 98, and I was talking to him, and I was really impressed. So Wolfgang's argument, I think the best book to present it is in the book entitled Vertical Causation, right? And he basically says there's sort of two problems in physics that point to the requirement of vertical causation. One is the measurement problem, and one is the actualization problem. The measurement problem is, and this is acknowledged, both of these are acknowledged. The first one is especially acknowledged as being a deep sort of epistemological problem within physics. The measurement problem basically says that you need your measurement entity to be at a higher ontological level than the level you're measuring, because it has to have a kind of constancy and continuity that the lower level will not have. So I can't measure quarks with quarks. Right, to just make it right. And this, of course, also interacts with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. But the argument is a very general argument, and so he says the only conclusion that seems to be available is that we say that the measuring entity, which must be at a higher ontological level, has as much realness as the level below it that it's measuring. And he calls this, he says, then he makes a distinction between what he calls the material level and then the corporeal level, which he means this level at which measurement entities exist.
Wait, what is the distinction between the material and the corporeal?
So the material, and I don't adopt this distinction, but I just want to make sure that I'm clearly presenting his view. The material level would be the level that is considered the fundamental aspects of physics, like the quarks and things like that. The corporeal level is the level, and this would be important to an argument I make, it's the level of the measuring instruments that we use to try and measure quarks, like the electron or the electron slit. We have to have gauges and detectors and computers, and they're operating at it. They have to operate it. He doesn't stop there, but he says...
Right, so according to Wolfgang Smith, the corporeal level is higher than the material level?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes. And that also, I think he could make a case that there's provenance for that, something similar to that in Aristotle. But, and then the actualization argument, right, is, so he presumes, and I think I do too, and I think it's hard not to, Bloch's argument is correct, and you have to go to the very, very bottom level in physics. And the very, very bottom level is levels of probability distributions. Right, and of course the famous problem there is what gives fire to the equations? What makes it go from something that's stated as an abstract possibility into a concrete actual event? And the point is, when you're at pure probability, pure possibility, that level can't do it for itself, and so you need
something has to actualize it.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Right, and of course this is almost exactly the Aristotelian idea of materia prima, which is conceived of as pure potentiality.
I think it's the same.
It's the same argument.
Yeah.
That's astounding.
So you get the measurement argument and the actualization argument. So let's review. We've got the argument from information, the argument for real causal signaling, the argument about the reality of structural functional organization, and then these linked arguments about real measurement and real actualization. Now, I craft an argument out of this, and the argument goes like this. One of the presuppositions of any scientific claim is that science, the entity and the activity must itself be a real thing. Because if science is illusory, then any statements or claims it makes would be illusory in that fashion. So putting this all together, the scientist, in order to really do science, needs real information. They need real causal signals. They need real structural functional organization, and they need real measurement and real actualization. Science has to be a real entity in its own right in order for it to use all these real things, to make the claims about the bottom level. And so it presupposes profoundly a leveled ontology in its own practice.
And it means the world has to be rational.
In a very
intelligible,
causal, measurable. I tend to use the term the world has to be intelligible.
That's good.
And with intelligible, which is really the same thing that the ancients affirmed when they talked about the noetic world.
Yes.
Exactly the same thing. The same sphere.
And which is real.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, now that brings up the question of, well, what is real? What is reality? And of course, let's say the dominant paradigm that the modern world works in is something like the idea of scientific materialism.
Yes.
A complete reductionism.
Flat ontology.
Right.
Physicalism.
Physicalism is a little bit different than materialism, and it's important. Because, a materialist is committed to the claim that all that really exists is matter and that everything else is, in some sense, illusory or epiphenomenal. I'll talk about epiphenomena in a minute. Whereas a physicalist says, no, that's not right. There are many things that really exist other than matter. There's matter, energy, time, space. There's forces. There's real causal relations. There's real temporal spatial relations, right? And then there are non-reductive physicalists, people who say, and I think they shouldn't keep using the word physicalist, or they should go back to the ancient meaning, physis, nature. And so many people prefer the term naturalism for a non-reductive, the idea that there are these levels of being. And then I argue for what I call an extended naturalism, which is we need to count as real not only what we can derive from the natural sciences, but what is presupposed by our natural sciences. And as I've just argued, this whole leveled ontology is presupposed by science, and therefore it has to count as equally real as anything that is derivable from our science.
And that's really one of the key points here, but also the important connection with what the world we live in is now. I mean, I can say the intellectual framework that dominates everything, our whole culture, our whole intellectual and academic landscape, even percolating down to just what the average person.
Yeah, love is just a chemical.
Right.
Yep. Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's so common. You hear it all the time in so many different ways. This materialist reductionism,
Which is one step away from nihilism.
which is one step away from nihilism,
Exactly.
and actually right now has started to come under attack from these kinds of skeptical nihilism.
Yes.
How much it will resist, I don't know. But for the moment, I would say it's the dominant paradigm.
I agree.
And so what that means is that if it's a dominant paradigm, it's what everybody, let's say, assumes or takes for granted, which means that if you are going to try to, I'll say, return to a realist metaphysic, the only way to get people to listen to you is if you start out with what is commonly accepted, namely the scientific materialism, which is what I think more or less that you're doing. You're saying, all right, we all agree that the scientific method works, and we all accept the results of the scientific method. And there are very few people who dispute the fact that the scientific method works and it produces results, and we use those results, in every aspect of our life. It's like you can't deny it because it's just right in front of your face. Except for those people who deny all of reality and
Right.
Are solipsist or
Yeah.
whatever, or I don't know, the brain in the vat idea,
exactly.
which itself is just taking the whole argument, a step backwards, and doesn't solve anything. Philosophically, it doesn't solve anything. So everybody is accepting the scientific method as being valid. The results of the scientific method, the practical, both the theoretical and the practical, the science and technology. But because it's reductive and it's only accepting material things as real, and because it works within a nominalistic framework, whereby all of these, what we perceive to be as categories or patterns within nature, are assumed to be purely the productions of the human mind, and not actually there in nature, which increasingly we are seeing, I think, because of an increasing recognition of the phenomenon of emergence as something that has causal power. We are seeing that there has to be some sort of return to a realism which is beyond mere materiality or materialism. And so, strangely, both scientists and most philosophers have ignored the question of what are the presuppositions of science. Let's say the philosophical or the metaphysical presuppositions of science, because of a skepticism which came in. You have the skepticism of Hume and a different form of skepticism of Kant, which are really undermining the scientific method itself, because it's questioning our human relationship with reality. Whether there is actually such a thing as real causation, the whole Kant's whole question about the problem of induction, and of course science is based on induction. You have the modern scientific method and the whole culture of science that it dominates in the world, but the presuppositions of science have been not only ignored but actually undermined by this ontological skepticism, which you have in one form from Kant and another form from Hume, which are of course I would say two of the major influences on the the history of Western thought. You can't ignore reality forever.
No, I think you have to. The presuppositions are that the scientific method really exists, and
it really exists.
And then the things it needs, real information, real causal signaling, etc., must also really exist. And then on pain of performative contradiction. And I agree with Whitehead that performative contradictions are just as important as propositional contradictions. Performative contradiction is not between propositions; it's between the proposition and the proposer. So, for example, I'm now going to do a performative contradiction. I am unconscious. In order to utter the statement, I cannot be in the state of being unconscious, right? And so and I think Whitehead is right. Performative contradictions are as important, if not more important, than propositional. And my argument is that if you claim only the bottom level is, because you're being scientific, you're actually falling into a profound performative contradiction. In order to be a scientist who's made measurements of real information so you can make that statement, you have to, right? You're engaging in a performative contradiction if you say all that's real is the bottom level.
Right.
Yeah.
Because just quarks floating there are not doing that.
They can't make propositions, right? Right.
Total indeterminacy.
Yeah,
exactly.
So this, I guess, For a person who's approaching these questions from the religious point of view, as obviously,
and I really want to enter into dialogue with
so
that.
you know, as I am, as an Orthodox bishop, as Father Patapios is, as an Orthodox priest, and of course in the context of our Orthodox seminary here, a lot of times we hear the word naturalism and we have a kind of knee-jerk negative response to that, because it sounds to us like it's a denial of the supernatural, it's a denial of God. But let's say the way that I understand you to be explaining this is not a denial of that so much as simply not talking about that that whole question, but rather taking the naturalism and, well, what you just said, basically talking about not only the effects but the presuppositions.
Yes.
And you call that extended naturalism.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think that your idea of extended naturalism is not something that we as religious people ought to be afraid of.
I don't think so.
Not at all.
Because I don't see it as an attack on, let's say, on our beliefs in God or in the, I'll call it the supernatural for lack of a better term right now, but rather it is exploring. We could say the philosophical, but more than that, it's the epistemological, it's the ontological.
Yes.
I believe it's also the ethical, which I want to talk about.
Yes, I do too.
Presuppositions of let's say base naturalism, and it is leading us in the direction of realism, and I think that you know, as I mentioned to you the other day, we have this.
Yeah.
There's this tendency, there's this push towards skepticism, which has been going on since at least nominalism, and it's been gaining momentum, and the ultimate, the end point of it is nihilism, and so you have this skeptical nihilism that starts pulling everything in when you go down that route of skepticism. The problem is it actually has nothing to do with the real world, at least as we experience it. And if I believe that if we want to avoid the pit of skeptical nihilism, that pure scientific materialism it cannot be a solution to that. It's insufficient, but rather what we must do is we must return to some sort of, let's call it, metaphysical realism, but it's more than that. It's epistemological realism. I believe it's also ethical realism, ontological realism, and when you, I'm just putting my 2 cents here, I guess, when you have all of those types of realism together, and when they are acknowledged by people, and when we try to actually relate to them in various ways, I believe that the result of that is substantially religious. It certainly moves in the religious direction, even if it's not affirming any specific religious proposition, idea, or practice. But it is moving in the religious direction. And so what that means, at least from my point of view, is that when you talk about extended naturalism, far from having a kind of let's say revulsion to the idea of naturalism, promoting naturalism, I see it rather the extension is moving in the religious direction.
Yes.
You know, whether you intend it or not.
Yeah.
I think that ultimately is the fact. So I know that you don't affirm, you know, let's say any established religion per se, but the direction that you move, that you move in, from the naturalistic point of view, moves in the religious direction. So I welcome your work, because I think that, you know, far from contradicting religion, it actually moves in the direction of affirming religion, even if that's not your intent.
Yes, I'm not affirming any one particular, but I do make arguments that this proposal, I think it's sufficiently developed enough to call it a theory. This theory extends to what I would call the sacred, and in very important ways.
Can I just add that it opens things up for everybody?
It
Everybody
does.
can talk meaningfully about this naturalistic framework. And you can have a dialogue between people who are religious and those who aren't religious. There's a common frame of reference.
That's exactly what I'm after, Father.
It's a terrific idea.
See, I talk about replacing the courtroom of debate, which was what our society's descended into the courtyard of dialogos, where we can have, or like I talk about the philosophical Silk Road, where Neoplatonism.
No, I love that phrase. I really love that phrase.
Beautiful.
Right, and where we can have we can have, because what happened on the Silk Road is you had many different religious traditions, but they had this shared courtyard of this Neoplatonic framework that allowed them to do exactly what you're talking about.
But you and I have talked about this, Your Grace, about how this classical culture, classical civilization really should be part of our discourse. I mean, it undergirds everything.
It certainly undergirds Western civilization, but it's not. On the one hand, Western civilization has become world civilization. But on the other hand, I don't think it contradicts any of the other great cultures of the world. You know, the Indian and the Chinese, in particular, because they were the other cultures which independently developed, a strong philosophical tradition. But it opens up a space, as you said, for constructive and positive conversation, not only between religion, but also between religion and the scientific world.
Well, this is one of my arguments. One of my arguments is, Neoplatonism has a proven track record in history of being able to enter into reciprocal reconstruction with Christianity, right? But also Judaism, Kabbalah, Islam, Sufism, right? And science, both in the Renaissance and at the beginning of the 20th century. Read John Spencer's book, The Eternal Law, and how much a lot of the scientists were influenced by Neoplatonism or things that are similar like Vedanta in order to bring about the Einsteinian and the quantum revolutions.
But it's not
and now again with this idea of emergence.
And it's doing it with to my mind, the reciprocal reconstruction is happening with cognitive science right now.
Right.
Very good.
So you have this tremendous convergence of so many different aspects, and
Exactly.
if you are, I don't know how optimistic we should be about this. I mean, I would like to be as optimistic as possible, but if this understanding can be generalized, because I believe it is both a better and a more true framework than the current scientific materialism that we're working on, and forget about the let's say the nihilistic take on postmodernism. That provides a common, constructive, and true framework for just about everybody across the whole world, from almost every point of view, to enter into constructive, positive, friendly relations with each other. It could even be, I don't want to say the principle of unity, but it could be, let's say, the field of unity.
I like that metaphor much better.
Right, and so, in the era that we're living in now of tremendous division, increasing polarization, which is getting worse and worse and worse. I think what you're presenting is a field of unity where, without without denying the real differences between different.
I would be engaged in a performative contradiction if I denied real differences, given that I invoked it in Blackowicz's argument, right?
Right. So it provides this field for us, and well, wouldn't that be a much better world?
Indeed. And there really are some advances in philosophy. Neoplatonism is not just Platonism; it has elements of Aristotle,
And
Stoicism.
Yeah.
It's a richer development in many ways. You can't stop with Plato and Aristotle.
Right, and I even make a distinction between pre-nominalist and post-nominalist Neoplatonism. I think there are significant things, like I've been talking about here, that are innovative. They're in continuity. I think they're in good faith continuity with the tradition of Neoplatonism, but they are post-nominalist. They are arguments that respond to nominalism, and I think that's something very exciting for me that's happening right now.
Well, I think our approach, let's say from the Orthodox point of view, or the religious point of view, or the transfigured Neoplatonist point of view. If it's going to be relevant to the modern world, has to take into account the developments, the intellectual developments which have occurred over the centuries. So we have to respond not only to Neoplatonism, but also to Humean skepticism, the Kantian divorce, and be able to respond to these not simply in the in a what's the word, polemic way, but also understanding what might be true or partly true in those ideas that we have to engage with in an important way, in order that our own understanding is not truncated. I think that Hume, for example, he raises some very important questions, some very important points.
Kant does too. Kant.
I don't think that the responses that he gives are adequate in any fashion at all. But I think that the questions that he raises are questions which, let's say, previously had not been raised by anybody, at least in that form or with that level of precision that he raised them. But that if we look at them, even from the specifically Orthodox point of view, but I don't think you would necessarily be exclusive to Orthodoxy at all, and we can give a response to those questions, which I believe even can enhance our own understanding of the faith and give it a broader and richer possibility of explanation.
And it's not a matter of going back to the ancients, it's actually going forward with the ancients. It's not back to the classics, forward, onward, upward with the classics as our foundation, and building upon that, enriching that, broadening that perspective. Extended naturalism is your way of doing it, but that's different.
Thank you, Father. I think that's a better way of putting it. Exactly.
You can't go back to
no,
Aristotle.
and
you can't leapfrog over the centuries and just ignore what's happened since that time. It's impossible.
I'm very suspicious of nostalgic moves or utopian moves.
Much as I admire Alasdair MacIntyre and his pivotal work After Virtue, there's a tendency to want to sidestep Kant and those who came after him. There are some wrong turnings, undoubtedly, but you can't just pass over that. And I'm not saying he necessarily does, but there's a kind of almost nostalgia. It's the way some people read him and try to take that as a kind of polemical tool. It's not supposed to be that way. It should be a resource we draw from to understand ourselves better and to be able to open up to each other and have this ongoing dialogue that you're talking about.
I have deep criticisms of Kant, but I have learned a lot from Kant. And people like Robert Brandom, Reason and Philosophy, about how Kant really prioritize the normativity in rationality as opposed to just a psychological, and that I think is, we don't need to get into that, but I think there's a lot of value in Kant. My own work on relevance realization and the framing is influenced by Kant. It doesn't end up in a Kantian conclusion, but very influenced by Kant, yes.